latest technologic innovations today.
And you don't have to pay.
Expert panels with advanced degrees are sure to satisfy your curiosity.
Did we mention it's free?
And if you think you'll find a better time than this, then come on down and test your hypothesis. Cause you're gonna learn a lot if you wanna stay down at the Science Cafe.
Hello, my name is Rick Irving. I am the moderator for the Science Cafe of New Hampshire in Nashua. It's monthly virtual meetings. So tonight I will be here with the two panelists that we have to discuss the topic tonight, and we will go ahead and get to the questions and answers, which is the meat of the matter, as soon as we can. But for the new audience members, what we'll do is go a little bit over the history of Science Cafe, and then we'll do some introductions for the panelists and give them a chance to talk about what they've done, their accomplishments, how they got into this. And then we will go right into the questions and answers, and that will take us all the way through to the end of the evening. So Science Cafe was started in 2011 by Dan Marchek here in Nashua, who is also the sort of grand poobah, chairman of the board for the Science Cafe of New Hampshire, especially in Nashua. And in that time, since then, the Science Cafe has grown to additional branches. We have Science Cafes in Concord, Portsmouth, Manchester, I believe Lebanon, and there might be a couple of other towns in New Hampshire. Here in Nashua, we've done probably more than 100 Science Cafes covering topics such as opioids and addiction, which was a very important topic here in New Hampshire. So we wound up doing that 3 different times in locations across the state. Things like forensic science, STEM education, 3D printing. We had a very interesting robotics session with a team from a local high school that actually won a national award, and they had their robots in the audience, actually walking around and performing for us. So that was pretty interesting. Flying cars, sleep. And the science of beer and the science of wine are always a big hit. So it's a very wide-ranging set of topics. Many of these have been filmed, and they are in our library. So if you go to the sciencecafenh.org, you should be able to find a lot of the sessions that we have taped over the last 5 or 6 years, and feel free to go ahead and view them. So after years of meeting and filming in a single location, most recently we used to get together at the Riverwalk Cafe in downtown Nashua, and we would have everybody, the panel, the audience, the Science Cafe staff, all in one room, and we would have microphones to videotape everybody and get the audio to all the audience as well as the videotape. But just like many other people, COVID has caused us to change that. So we have evolved the Science Cafe into a virtual meeting, which is what you're seeing right now, of course. And we started that in May of this past year, May of 2020. And the first topic we had, by the way, was coronavirus. That was early in the pandemic. So the excellent panel that we had, we were able to explain a lot of the terminology and the things that were going on. And it was very interesting and very educational. One of the advantages that having a virtual cafe enables us to do is have a much more wide-ranging reach to engage the audience for our sessions. So, when we first started, we would make these sessions available to the local public access TV stations in New Hampshire. And very shortly after we started doing that, stations across the nation started picking it up. I think within 1 month, it was three states, and within 2 months, it was up to like 8 states. So now we have a much more wide-ranging audience. And in fact, just a couple of months ago, we had a viewer from New Zealand join us. So that is very exciting. And the other exciting aspect to this is that we get to have our expert panelists from all across the country. And, when we did the flying car sessions, for example, the CEO of a flying car company in California was one of our panelists. So in the past, where we had to have everybody in one room, we can now do this virtually and have much more input to the audience, as well as having reach to some of the expert panelists. So tonight, once again, we are all isolated. So the panelists, the audience, and the staff here for the Science Cafe are all individually located, and we're separate. And we will go ahead, and I will introduce the panelists in a second, but I want to remind you that the heart and soul of the Science Cafe is really the interchange between your questions, the audience, and the panelists' responses. So that dialogue is really where the value comes in. So we want to encourage the audience to ask your questions. You can do that by going to the comment section in Facebook or YouTube and supplying those. This is live, so we will get your questions. And if you include your name and where you're from, then I will also read that online. But the questions and the panelists' answers are really what makes this work, and it's our metric for success. So please do that early and often, as many questions as you'd like. We have roughly an hour, and we'll get to as many as we can. But again, as I said, it is live. Tonight's topic is Sasquatch and Bigfoot. What does the evidence say? And from that, we are very likely to delve in further into the cryptozoology field, where cryptozoology is defined as, and I'll have to read this, the study of and search for animals whose existence or survival is disputed or unsubstantiated. For example, the Loch Ness Monster, the Yeti, Bigfoot, Sasquatch. Seemingly since the beginning of time, this has been a worldwide phenomenon. Now, for our panelists, I will introduce you to them and then let them have a few minutes to talk about themselves and what their interests were, how they got here, and what their accomplishments are. So first, I am going to start with Mark. And so Mark is an avid naturalist with a focus on bird watching and natural history. He has led nature walks in and around the greater Nashua, New Hampshire area. And some of these walks have led him to becoming interested in researching in cryptozoology. He has had a series of discoveries in the field and has had encounters and interactions in the forests of southern New Hampshire and north central Massachusetts, findings that corroborate some other people's experiences. So, Mark, please tell us about yourself.
Yes, thank you, Rick. I grew up in rural Connecticut, and luckily across from a lake where I was really into fishing and bird watching and all things nature. So that really set a foundation in me of learning to appreciate and get interested in, the natural world and creatures. Also, at that time, I became interested in what you might call the edges of science, topics like UFOs and cryptozoology, just from a reading perspective. I just found that fascinating. But as I grew older and had some science background in college, I was more attracted to those aspects of what you might call the paranormal that had a hard scientific basis or something that could be tested. Such as, for instance, crop circles. And for several years, I was a field assistant to Nancy Talbot, who is one of the preeminent crop circle researchers in the world. And I actually was able to visit a few crop circles in New England, believe it or not, that occurred in the early 90s and 2000s. And at one point, Nancy was also interested in photographic anomalies that could be captured at crop circle sites or stone circle sites or, other associated with paranormal phenomenon. And so she sent me this YouTube video documentary, and the title was Speaking of Sasquatch. And it was about the experiences of this researcher in Canada called Mike Patterson, who claimed to have these very close interactions with Sasquatch. And Nancy had asked me to look at the video to see the photographic anomalies. Now, my first reaction was, Nancy, give me a break. I'll give you crop circles and UFOs, but Sasquatch, that is going too far. At the time, I thought Sasquatch and Bigfoot gave the paranormal a bad name. But, after about 2 weeks it took me to get to it, I finally watched it, and I was actually fascinated by the quality of the evidence and the photographic anomalies too, and actually the vocalizations that these beings supposedly made. And shortly after that, when I went into the forest bird watching and doing other activities, I started having strange, odd experiences that really couldn't be explained, such as hearing a tree falling right in front of me and not being able to see it. And I started finding these little structures in this area that I would go bird watching, and I thought, that's very interesting. So after a little bit more research, I came across this person called Christopher Noel from Vermont, who did a documentary about these supposed structures that these beings make out of wood. And so I said, that's kind of interesting. Maybe that would explain what I saw. So I sent that video to my chiropractor, actually, who is interested in paranormal phenomenon. And he told me, hey, I was fishing with my son at this trout stream not too far from here, and we came across this really odd teepee. Would you like to see it? And I said, sure. So about a week later, I went out with him to see it, and that's where everything started. And it was almost like I was getting a lesson in what these things were all about. And I have many pictures and stories that I can share later. But basically, it was sort of synchronicity or serendipity that I fell into this. I did not seek it out. But I did follow the leads. I suspended judgment and I kept an open mind, but I wasn't automatically gullible and believing everything. I wanted to do experiments, and I can describe those as well. So that in just a few minutes is how I got into this.
Well, that's fascinating. I can't wait to talk more about it. Our next panelist is Aleks Petakov, and Aleks is a filmmaker. So Aleks has traveled across the U.S. and actually worldwide, looking into various cryptozoological creatures like the Loch Ness Monster, the Lake Champlain Monster, which I'd never heard of, as well as other phenomenon such as UFOs and mysterious places, ranging from the paranormal Bridgewater Triangle here in southeastern Massachusetts to the Hermit Kingdom of North Korea. And I can't wait to talk about this. Aleks has also created short documentary films and series on the subjects. So, Aleks, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Rick. Thanks to the Science Cafe. Very cool that you guys are still able to do this type of event virtually. Obviously, a lot of things nowadays are virtual, so that's good. Just a little bit of background on myself. As you mentioned, I'm a filmmaker. That's sort of the perspective I approach this topic from. How I got interested initially was as a child. I was told about the story of the Yeti, the abominable snowman. I started watching a lot of documentaries on that topic and just really became interested from there. I think a lot of people have that same sort of fascination with the unknown, whether it be UFOs or Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster. These sorts of things are very culturally known, and obviously there's a lot of documentaries and television programs that reflect that cultural interest. So I started reading books on the topic from absolutely fabulous authors and folks who had researched this from the 60s on. We're talking about John Green and Renee DeHinden and John Bindernagel, Dr. Jeff Meldrum, a lot of very esteemed people, including some academics, Dr. Grover Krantz, who really stuck their neck out on a topic like Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Now, I'm interested more broadly in cryptozoology. I think Bigfoot is one of the most popular of the cryptids. Everyone's heard of Bigfoot for the most part, and the Loch Ness Monster. Those two are kind of in the top. So as I got older, I just kept, I was sort of an armchair researcher, I'd say. I would just read all the blogs. This was kind of in the 2000s when I was younger, and that's when the blog sphere was really strong, and that's where a lot of information with the rise of the internet was coming about cryptozoology. Somebody like Lauren Coleman, who's the director of the International Cryptozoology Museum in Maine, actually had a site where he would post updates. There'd be sightings of the thylacine in Australia, which is a previously thought to be extinct marsupial kind of dog-looking animal that was last seen in the 1930s, I believe, that died in captivity. But there's still sightings to this day, and that fits within cryptozoology. So I kept reading those kinds of sites. As I got older, life kind of took over. My interest in the subject sort of dropped. And it wasn't until after I got out of college, actually, in 2015, that I decided to actually start researching on my own, in the sense that I was going to start doing documentaries. I had a love for filmmaking, and communications is something I have a background in. So it just kind of seemed to go pretty well together. So I decided to tackle these topics. And I've traveled to Loch Ness, actually. That was one of my first cryptozoological documentaries. And I just kind of poked around with my camera and asked locals, and talked to a gentleman who lives there on the shores of Loch Ness, who is a Guinness Book of World Record holder for the longest monster hunter, I think the longest Loch Ness monster hunter. Got to interview him, and from there I did a documentary on it. And since then, I've just met people through the power of the internet, and friends. I've met some great, fantastic people in this community, researchers and other filmmakers. And as you mentioned, I've done a series on the Loch Ness Monster, actually a Champ as well, which is America's Loch Ness Monster, to say. That was in 2017. And my most recent documentary, actually, that came out right around when COVID first started locking everything down back in March, is called Lions of the East, which was actually about mountain lions in New England, which some people think, that may not be as interesting of a cryptid perhaps as something like a Bigfoot, but it's still part of cryptozoology. It's treated very similarly, and there is a very interesting phenomena there. But when it comes to Bigfoot, I've done a long form sort of documentary series that I started in 2016 with just interviewing people who have claimed to have seen it in New England and across the country, and been in various places, and just spent time with researchers out in the field, and had some strange things happen. Nothing I can say conclusively was Bigfoot, but I've had some interesting encounters that I'm sure we can talk about. And I believe using the scientific method is a very important thing to do when you're researching these sorts of things with a topic like Sasquatch or Bigfoot. It's very much citizen science in a lot of cases, and you have a lot of amateurs out there, and there's nothing wrong with amateurs, but science in general doesn't really want to take a lot of credibility from people that are just sort of spending their weekends in the woods. And there are some groups out there, as I can talk about, that absolutely follow the scientific method and do a fantastic job in documenting from weather conditions, just like weather conditions, to tree patterns, all sorts of things that they notice in areas that they study, which I think is what's very much needed for a subject like this, because I lean more on the fence that there actually is something like a Bigfoot or Sasquatch in existence, as hard as that may be to believe for some folks. But at this point, it's the amount of people that I've spoken to, and I would put a few in a group that I would consider very, very credible, that I truly believe they experienced what they experienced, and they believe that they experienced something. And I can't say whether or not they did. I wasn't there, obviously, but hopefully through further study and like I mentioned, using scientific method, we can actually produce some viable evidence, because there has been evidence over the years, and I think largely it's been ignored. But times may be changing with the younger generations, and the interest in this subject is just still very strong. And so I approach it from that filmmaking perspective. When I look at a topic, I don't consider myself really a field researcher in that aspect. I'm more of a cryptozoology researcher, in the sense that I look at a topic, let's say mountain lions. I will talk to people who are fish and game, locals who claim to have had witnesses, maybe amateur researchers, boots on the ground, studying the history of the area, the terrain, the geography. You get a holistic picture. So I may not come out at the end saying, well, there's definitely mountain lions here, but when I'm trying to create an informed piece like a documentary, I want to give the audience as much information as I possibly can, and ultimately let them make up their own mind whether or not this is a viable subject, or whether or not something like mountain lions or Sasquatch might exist. Just kind of not really imposing my own beliefs on it, but presenting equally perspectives from both people who might be considered skeptics as well as those who are diehard believers. So that's the kind of approach that I take.
Okay, well, that is fascinating. This is going to be a fun hour. Now, in full disclosure, I told Alex the other day that I actually grew up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, and the Hockomock Swamp was right behind my house. The Hockomock Swamp is sort of geologically, it's sort of in the center of the Bridgewater Triangle. So I am very interested to see what sort of creatures and abnormal things you have seen back there. And my mother is watching, so we can scare her as well. So, with that, we actually have our first question already.
Sure.
And then we're going to go right into questions and answers, and hopefully this will take us all the way through to the end. So the first question is from Shyla Joe Nelly. Even today, new species are being discovered, and species thought to be extinct. The
coelacanth.
Okay, we'll go with that. Coelacanth. We're still around. Are these strange creatures possibly variants of the above mentioned categories as opposed to monsters that they are described as?
Sure. I could take that one if you'd like.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And that's a great example that Shiloh has brought up with the coelacanth. So the coelacanth was actually a prehistoric, and if you Google coelacanth, you can see how prehistoric looking they are. It's a fish that was believed to have gone extinct millions of years ago until a live specimen was actually caught on a fishing boat off the coast of South Africa in the 1930s, I believe, and it kind of shocked scientists and paleontologists at the time. It was supposed to be extinct, but yet they're still alive. And we now know of populations of coelacanth that exist off the coasts of, in the Pacific Ocean, off the coast of Africa, and closer to the Seychelles and near in the Indian Ocean as well. Really fascinating that this animal, like I said, that was thought to be extinct. So it's kind of become a little bit of a spokes creature, let's say, for cryptozoology. The Cryptozoology Museum in Maine, that is their mascot, is the coelacanth. There have been several other animals like this. So gorillas, actually, when Europeans were colonizing and exploring parts of Africa, a lot of locals, especially in some of the mountainous regions like the Virunga and the Congo, present-day Congo, where mountain lions exist, or mountain gorillas, too many animals in mountains, but that's a good place for these creatures to hide. So mountain gorillas were described as these hairy man-like creatures that were terrifying and lived up in the mountains and were very elusive. And of course, those stories were written off as just native folklore, kind of disparaged, until these creatures were actually found, killed, and documented, basically. So you have instances, and I think Shiloh brings up a really interesting point with them being considered monsters. I don't think majority of these are really monsters in the sense that they're a monster from a movie or a Halloween creature, something that's going to murder you. I mean, there are very dangerous animals out there, of course. But I think the term monster is just something that culturally gets placed on a lot of these animals, like the Loch Ness monster. It's just something mysterious. It's unfamiliar. So you have many different Sasquatch stories across North America, local variants that take on monster. For example, one in Arizona, the Mogollon monster, the Fouke monster of Fouke, Arkansas. They just kind of they'll usually put a local geographical term with it and then throw a monster in there, because a lot of times these stories in Massachusetts and the Leominster area, there's an area called Monster Land that resulted in, prior to the Second World War, sightings of strange hairy creatures that were considered to be monsters, and that's just sort of made sense. Monster Land. A lot of these stories that were local variations of what we might call Bigfoot now were created before there was a term Bigfoot. Now, of course, the term Bigfoot is everywhere. It's as is Sasquatch, and those are two terms that were. Sasquatch was from British Columbia originally, and it was an anglicized word from a local native language, First Nations language, and it was used to describe these hairy creatures that they had in their folklore. And I believe I actually have some pictures that I sent to Scott, which kind of describe some of the artwork there from these tribes, which are pretty interesting. But Bigfoot was in the 1950s in Northern California with these crews, these logging crews that were discovering strange tracks in the woods as they were logging. And then a local journalist called them Bigfoot, and that kind of became well known across the country through the AP Newswire. So there's a lot of these photos. What I could do is mention one specifically. So if we could go to ceremonial mask 1, that would be an interesting. Basically, these are all from across different cultures describing similar things to what we see today in terms of Sasquatch, or what's reported at least. So it's always been culturally present, the idea that there's these humanoid type creatures that are very similar to us throughout different cultures. Some people even look back to the Epic of Gilgamesh and Enkidu and claim that was some sort of a wild man. Of course, humans at one point lived with various other hominids, Neanderthal, Denisovans, even the supposed hobbits, the Homo floresiensis that lived in parts of Indonesia, very small type of people. So there's always been other hominids that have been alive during that time. And these, of course, are some ceremonial masks from British Columbia, and a lot of people have looked at these and speculated, well, they look almost ape-like in the facial features and the grinning. That's something that we know chimps and other primates do. So how would tribes in remote parts of the mountains of British Columbia have knowledge of ape facial features? So I think that's very interesting, and this is very much a part of their culture in that area.
Oh, fascinating. So Dan Marchek, the founder of the Science Cafe, is a fisherman, and I can't wait till next month. And he tells me how he caught a boat full of coalents in the Long Island Sound. So Dan also asks, can you describe the Bridgewater Triangle?
Sure. Yeah, the Bridgewater Triangle is an area in southeastern Massachusetts, which is not really a triangle, but humans like the triangle as a sort of geographic area. It's easy to visualize. People think of the Bermuda Triangle, and the Bridgewater Triangle was actually coined by Loren Coleman in the 1970s, I believe, who was one of the first really investigating some of the reports, because you have strange stuff that's gone on there. That's the area near, not too far from the Plymouth colony. Of course, that's where there was the so-called King Philip's War between the settlers and the local Wampanoag tribe, and the Hockomock was the place that they considered to be cursed. They called it the place where spirits dwell. In the Hockomock, they didn't really like to go in there, but during that war, they actually retreated into there at some points, and there was a lot of bloody history in that area, and supposedly a curse was placed in the area. That's part of the folklore, at least. And to this day, there's been strange reports of people seeing UFOs, strange lights in the swamp in the Hockomock. You have these reports of these Pukwudgie creatures, which are basically from Wampanoag folklore. They're described as small demon-like creatures. You have Bigfoot reports, strange dogs with red eyes, lots of these kind of urban legend ghost stories as well. You have a ghost trucker of Copacabana Road near the reservoir there. Lots of stories along those lines. So I think it's become one of the most famous triangle areas, probably after the Bermuda Triangle, and a lot of people actually visit that area today specifically to look for strange things. And I think that it needs some caution as well, because once an area gets on a life like that, it takes on a name of its own, and it has a life of its own. You have people that go there specifically trying to have something happen. So I think, maybe there were legitimate encounters that happened in the past, but now we have a lot of people, it's kind of hyperbole. They go out there and they hear something strange, and it's automatically one of the many things that have been reported there. And then you also have perhaps the phenomenon of, you have a group of people that go in there and they pretend to do some Bigfoot wood knocks or whoops. And then you have a ghost hunting team a mile away and they hear it. And then they say, well, we heard Bigfoot out there while we were looking for ghosts at that haunted building there. So it's interesting, and it's just fascinating, as I believe they're actually in the works to do a TV show about the Bridgewater Triangle, a drama. I think FX or one of these channels. It's just, so that just shows culturally it's how much it's picked up steam. And I mean, it more so than even 20, 30 years ago. A lot of people that grew up in the area didn't even really know it was supposedly this haunted spot, and that became popularized through works of authors like Christopher Walzano, of course, Loren Coleman, and then documentaries on the subject. You've had quite a few that have been done, including the fabulous documentary for those that want a primer really into what the Bridgewater Triangle is. It's called The Bridgewater Triangle. It's on Amazon. My friend Aaron Cadieux did it. It's fantastic. I'm not just saying that because he's my friend. It's actually a very well-made documentary about all the strange aspects of the triangle, from the satanic cult activity in the Freetown State Forest and the gangland murders that have happened there. So real true crime mixed with people claiming they've seen Bigfoot in the swamp there. So it's a little bit of everything. It's a very interesting area.
So I'm with the Wampanoags, and as you said, people that lived there 20 or 30 years ago. Let's say that's when I was growing up. Might have been a little before that, but went out with a couple of friends and my brother to figure we'd build a cabin in the woods there to just use as a hut. And it was the snakes that actually drove us out of there pretty quickly, as well as it was just so mossy and so wet that I don't think I ever went back there. But yeah, I had no idea about any of these phenomenons until recently, but I did grow up right there. And like I said, it's right behind the house.
Yeah, there's a very a scary snake report out of the Bridgewater Triangle. People seeing a black snake as thick as a stovepipe that's been seen out there. So hopefully you didn't run into anything like that.
I did not, no. Okay, thank you. Let's see, I have a question for Mark. You had mentioned the crop circles in your travels, and I was wondering, when you got there, what did you see, and sort of what conclusions did you draw from being there?
Okay, let's see. this is a big topic that could be the subject of a science cafe in itself. Basically, I believe a lot of them are man-made, especially more recently. But going back to the 70s and 80s, and there's actually evidence that they occurred in medieval times and perhaps before. But you'll get swirled crops, and what the research has found in the quote authentic crop circles is that the plants appear to be heated very quickly and rapidly, such that the node of the plant will swell with water vapor, causing the plant to fall over. And so that's how you get the bent without breaking phenomenon. Nancy Talbot also organized groups of scientists to look into the soils and found that they would often be affected as well. And sometimes soils at the surface would exhibit signs that they were under pressure, such as you would find in soils that were 500 feet underground, say. So there was evidence that both the soils and the plants were changed by this type of energy. The causative nature of that energy, of course, is the biggest question, but she was more concerned with the mechanics to show that it was indeed anomalous and not something that could be explained by planks and boards or hoaxing or weather phenomenon either. So it's a fascinating topic, and it's one that gave me a sort of a scientific basis for my later exploration into Sasquatch and finding odd stick structures in the woods and setting up experiments to see if I could get them to react to me. And it appears that I've had a little bit of success in that regard.
Okay, I definitely want to come back to that. But we have a question from Stacy that might be for both of you. Are there any hotspots to search in New Hampshire?
Yes, if you don't mind, I'll take that first real quick. Yeah, without giving away exact locations, like I'm not going to tell you go park in this trailhead parking lot at this particular forest, mainly for the reason that I, respect these beings. I'm not sure if they want me to be divulging their location. The other is, there might be a few people that get wind of this and they say, I can go out there and try to shoot one. Oh. But in general, I would say that it appears that these beings are much more widespread than I would ever thought. I mean, I had once thought that if they existed at all, they were only in the Pacific Northwest. But now it appears that any large forest block, say of about 1,000 acres or so as a core area, is something that would be large enough to sustain a small population of these beings, perhaps. You want to look for water, too, either lakes and ponds or streams, some sort of water source. And I found that the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border region, all the way from the western edge of the Merrimack River Valley here in Nashua and Manchester, if you go west towards the Wapak Range and towards Vermont, just about that entire forest, there will be pockets of activity. Not that every area will have these beings or signs of these beings, but I found that, Leominster State Forest is mentioned by Aleks. That's an area that is famous and there's a book written about it, so I don't mind mentioning that. But if you look for forest blocks that are similar in size to the Leominster State Forest, and you look just west of us, you will see that there are many places that are suitable for this sort of research and for these beings to live in. And I've also found that they appear to come in as long as they might travel along fingers of forest or green belts, as long as they can retreat back into their core forest area. So it's remarkable that, I believe these beings occur in this area. And it's pretty astounding. It still amazes me. So turn it over to Aleks. I know he probably has a few things to say about that too.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not so much sure if there are specific hotspots in an area like New Hampshire and in New England in general. I think because, again, many do not believe these beings to exist. I lean more on that side, I would say, but still we have to be very critical of purported evidence and those sorts of things. And I think that if you look at some of the forests now in New Hampshire as compared to 100, 150 years ago when much of the state was deforested, you have a lot of forest that has come back. I mean, New Hampshire is the second most forested state in the United States, I should say, after Maine. And we're just talking amount of forest, percentage wise. I think it's somewhere in the high 80s. I have the map that I did send to Scott. I believe it is, I'm looking at it now, it says 84%, Maine is at 89%, and then the third would be West Virginia. But you have a lot of states throughout the East Coast that have a lot of forest land, actually. And if Scott wouldn't mind pulling up there's 3 maps. So I want to illustrate something, folks. So the first one would be map showing Bigfoot sightings map. So we could just pull that one up. I think it should be just labeled Bigfoot sightings map. Well, either way, that's fine. So basically, there are sightings across the East Coast, and throughout the South, and into the parts of the West as well. And on the map, you can kind of see in some of these forested areas, that's typically where a lot of the sightings happen. They don't really happen in some of the drier areas of North America. The Midwest, there's a lot less reported sightings than there are. So yes, so this is roughly a sightings map, and then there's a second map which can be shown kind of after this, which shows rainfall across the United States. And it's very interesting if you compare those 2 maps, how similar they actually look, because you have sort of sightings in those same areas. In the Pacific Northwest, which actually has temperate rainforests, tends to have the most amount of sightings anywhere in the United States, which I think is pretty interesting. But in terms of New Hampshire, I think because New England and Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, some of these forests are contiguous, you can really get from these areas in forests, and there are suitable habitats for large animals like moose. I mean, a large adult male moose can weigh up to 1,500 pounds. So if we're talking about environmentally, it's possible that, if a moose or other animals could be sustained, perhaps a large primate might be able to be sustained. I don't know. But I think, there definitely are areas where there's some encounters. And I think, like I said, in terms of hotspots, I think that it's more in the line of, well, people have had sightings in certain areas. So that doesn't necessarily mean maybe there's many living there or whatever. It's just sort of people have seen it there, maybe just passing through. I mean, Hollis, New Hampshire had a famous rash of sightings in the 70s, which culminated in the Hollis flea monster incident at the flea market, where a trailer was shooken and the guy was from Lowell. He ended up actually leaving the area, leaving his trailer there at the flea market, went to the police station, reported it, drove all the way back, said that he came face to face with this tall, blonde-colored haired creature that smelled like rotting fish. And at one point, an anthropologist from Harvard got involved and actually did an interview with him and did a polygraph, which, is not admissible in a court of law anymore because they can be fake. But at the time, it was considered in the 70s and 80s to be a legitimate means, and interviewed the gentleman and said, he believes what he saw. He doesn't believe it was a bear, as the police chief suggested. So there are sightings like that. This creature was probably just passing through, if anything. But there are definitely large forested areas where, if you wanted to go out looking, and in terms of the structures, I'm a little on the fence just in general about those. I've seen things out there that I think are interesting that, don't look like they're just natural. And of course, in New England and some of these areas, you do have large branches that can get twisted and create some pretty interesting formations. And there are some things that absolutely are done by people. I mean, I used to do wilderness training, and we used to build lean-tos and nest-like things and other little primitive shelters all throughout the woods in deep, remote spots that people don't really go to, just to kind of, practice our bushcraft skills and those sorts of things. So that certainly exists. You have to look at if it's close to a city or a very populated area, it's close to the trail, probably might be people in a lot of those cases. And there's really only one sighting I can think of in New Hampshire where there was something, there was actually a creature inside a strange structure. It happened in 1979 in the Ospey Mountains, where a gentleman from Maine was rock collecting up there on Bald Mountain. He came across this structure made of stacked rocks with a thatched roof of hemlock. And there was this enormous creature sitting inside, and his dog started growling, and this thing let out some sort of a ungodly scream. And it sent him and his girlfriend and dog running back down the mountain. And I had a chance to interview him about his sighting. He wasn't sure what it was, but he said, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about seeing this thing. And this was, I interviewed him a few years ago, and the incident happened in 1979. So it would remain vivid in his memory. So I think, like I said, in terms of hotspots in New Hampshire, I don't know exactly what would be a hotspot. I'd say probably areas like the White Mountains and the Great North Woods. They're habitat for thousands of bear and moose and other predators and coyotes and very large deer populations. So I think those are great areas where these creatures can remain elusive. If they do live in more populated areas down here in the South and into Massachusetts, they're definitely have to be a little bit more strategic. And, there's some great researchers in Massachusetts, a group called Squatchachusetts. They have a very cool name, of course. It sounds humorous, but they do some really great work, Jonathan Wilk and his crew, and they've collected a lot of reports from Western Massachusetts and the central part of the state, which are the lesser populated, more forested areas. Of course, there's not sightings in Harvard Square, or at least, credible sightings, that is. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of data being brought in, which is interesting. And they've even noticed that it doesn't really seem to be hotspots, but there may be certain areas, certain properties where people report activity year after year. That may just be an area that, like other animals, will inhabit the same area. Moose, during the winter, they stay in one area. And then what happens usually is the males move up into higher elevation, females down into lower elevations, maybe hills, and they like swampy areas, of course. And then in the summer, they'll move on to different areas. So could be that these creatures, like many others, have lived in an area, and then a housing development comes in. And that's why a lot of people that live in rural areas of New England will know and have regular interactions with moose and bear and other creatures that just, their backyard is basically the animal's living room. So a lot of people will relate to that. And there are across the country instances of what people call habituation sites, where people claim to have had years of activity. I actually know a guy in an area that I would kind of consider my research spot, if we were to put it that way, in New Hampshire, where he's claimed to have had activity for years on his property and didn't really put it together until at one point later, where he kind of realized, maybe this is what's going on. This explains all the weird stuff. And what's interesting, actually, a lot of these places, forests, have been reported to be haunted because strange things will happen. Rocks will be thrown. You'll hear movement and something will just vanish almost. So I think a lot of areas that actually claim to be haunted might have Sasquatch activity, which I think, biologically might satisfy scientists perhaps more than the possibility of ghosts existing. I don't know, but it's definitely interesting.
Great. Okay.
Yeah, Rick, I would just add too, I would concur with Aleks that, I'm monitoring several different locations, and I've been doing this for a few years, and I've lately got into audio recording as well. And I get the sense that they will leave one area because, it seems to go quiet, and I don't get any sort of sense of their presence or see any changes in structures or find footprints. It seems like they left. And then I will find another area, maybe 20 miles away, where they seem to be active. So I believe that just like the Native Americans had to, in order to, allow the game to restore itself, they have to move around. They have to live a somewhat nomadic lifestyle.
Wow, very interesting. Okay, our next question comes from Susan Lindberg, and it's, are Sasquatch, Bigfoot, and Yeti all related? And are they similar to Neanderthals?
I know Aleks probably has a lot to say here, but I'll just, apparently Sasquatch, Bigfoot, and Yeti seem to be the same type of being. Yeti being the Himalayan or, Indian subcontinent version. Whether they're related to species of hominid like Neanderthals is a good question. I don't know how you could even answer that, but that is interesting. I mean, there's one theory that Bigfoot is a species Gigantopithecus, which actually existed, was a vegetarian, probably 8 to 10 foot tall hominid that would fit the Bigfoot description. And I believe it lived in China as recently as about 1 million years ago, but it went extinct. So some people have the theory that this is a population of those, which who knows? It's until somebody captures one and is able to do DNA analysis, I don't think we can really answer that question fully, though it's something that's interesting to entertain.
Alex?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. I think there are, when people think of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Yeti, think of the same sort of thing. People have that image of the Yeti, though, as being white colored fur, which is actually kind of a misnomer. That's not the case. The reports in the Himalayas and Nepal and Tibet describe very similar hair color, either dark black or brown, orangish, reddish kind of color. There have been sightings of, white Bigfoot, supposedly, which probably maybe are gray. I mean, the Wood Devil story from northern New Hampshire, Coos County, describe hairy creatures with gray hair. Now, that could be maybe an age thing. I don't really know. There could be variation, just like with other animals. Mountain lions, you have, tawny colored versus very light, dust colored almost. There's kind of a spectrum that can vary with different creatures. But I think across the world, there are different sightings of different creatures. So in North America, even within North America, there's a little bit of a different description in the Pacific Northwest and in Canada and into the Northeast. And here in this area, there's a very similar kind of larger creature that's described as 7 to 9 feet tall and that sort of thing. And in the South, it's a little bit, usually a little bit shorter with shaggy hair and a smell. I mean, in Florida, it's considered to be the skunk ape. And there are actually some reports across the country that describe a smell. Now, gorillas actually have a trait where they can control their scent glands if they're agitated or angry. And some reports, not a minority, but definitely less than 50% of reports describe a putrid odor or a smell. But in Florida, you have the skunk ape. Now, that could be just simply living in a swamp-like environment. You take on a certain smell, a certain kind of musky smell when you're living out there. But in Asia, as Mark was mentioning with Gigantopithecus, that was one of the largest primates known to ever exist. It's not determined if it's a hominid just yet. We're not sure, because believe it or not, the only fossil evidence we have that exists are some teeth bones and parts of a jawbone. And they were actually discovered in Chinese apothecary shops prior to the Second World War by paleontologists, because a lot of these ancient fossils would be discovered and sold to these shops. They would grind them up. They were considered to be the bones of dragons and used in Chinese medicinal purposes. So that's actually how a lot of paleontological discoveries in China were in shops. So the Gigantopithecus was believed to be a relative of the orangutan, possibly. So it's not sure if it was, a bipedal ape, I should say, but it was definitely one of the largest out there. It could be, the literal inspiration for King Kong, if you kind of think about it that way. And it's theorized that perhaps it crossed the land bridge from Asia in Bering Straits to Alaska, and then, as many of the other species supposedly came over here, such as woolly mammoths and people as well. The Native Americans, the First Nations people. That's a possible theory. Other people have disagreed with that, said no, it has to be something more closely related to human beings. In parts of Russia, you have the sightings of the Almas and the Almasty in the Caucasus region, actually, where people have seen some things with spears and possibly primitive clothing. And this is actually the area where they've discovered the Denisovans and other hominids that were on the Homo lineage, so they would have been really related to us and the Neanderthals. So some speculate maybe there are still surviving bands of those, people that live out there. And then you have something like the Homo floresiensis, which I mentioned earlier, which was described, it's called the Hobbit, it's kind of the nickname, discovered only in the mid-2000s in some caves on an island in Indonesia called Flores. So they were described as basically small people. Now, what's interesting, in other parts of Indonesia, you have the sightings of the orang pendek, which is described as a 3 to 4 foot tall, hairy man-like creature that is said to be very elusive, and the locals differentiate it from the orangutans, which they're all familiar with, which do not look or cannot be misconstrued as looking like a person, a small person. They kind of have long arms and very lumpy, round bodies. They don't look very human-like. Chimps look more human-like if we were to compare it that way. But there's been sightings of the orang pendek by UN workers actually in the area. The Dutch, when they colonized that area, they heard stories from the locals, and there are supposedly sightings by Dutch soldiers and that sort of thing in the time. And it's just interesting that those stories exist not far from where evidence of a human species has been discovered as recently as the last 2 decades, which I think is pretty interesting. So across the world, you have different stories. I think there are probably multiple things going on here, but the North American, in Canada and the United States, Bigfoot-like creature typically tends to be not really described as using tools or clothes or anything like that. It's much more wild sort of being.
Okay. And our next question is from Tom Mansour, and it is for Mark. Can you tell us more about your experiments and your findings?
Thank you, Rick. Scott, if you could put up my slides, I will go through those because that's the best way to illustrate these. Okay, while Scott is getting the slides, I just want to give a little background. I shared a video on Sasquatch structures, which was put together by Christopher Noel in Vermont, who's a researcher up there in the Green Mountains. And his YouTube site is called Impossible Visits. And he had a video on structures, which I shared with my chiropractor, who's into all this sort of odd things. And again, he told me, he was fishing with his son. And what I like to see, this strange teepee they found. And that is my first picture, which I hope Scott can find soon. One thing that my chiropractor told me too when we visited the site, he says, oh yeah, my daughter and son-in-law live right down the road about 1.5 miles. And late at night, one night after they got back from Boston, it was after midnight, they were having a glass of wine on their deck, and they saw this huge humanoid shape run through their backyard at incredible speed, carrying a giant stick. So I said, that's interesting. We find these structures here in this sort of like little offshoot part of the state forest. And here we go.
Great. Perfect.
Okay, that's a picture of my chiropractor. I won't name him, but he practices in Massachusetts, and that's the odd teepee that we found by the river. You'll notice that just to the left of his lower foot, there's what appears to be ground decoration or sticks sort of low to the ground. I found that interesting, and that's a feature that I later found at many sites. So after he showed me this, we figured out that really it would serve no human purpose. Where he's standing is actually a ditch that would collect water in the rain, so it's not a place that you'd want to stand to get out of the rain or even throw a tarp on it. If you were fishing, the river is about 10 feet towards the front. So I said, well, let's look into the forest interior. Let's see if there's any corroborating evidence. So next slide. Photo 2. We went up into the woods. This is about 500 feet away, and we saw this really odd structure that it looks haphazard here, but is extremely well constructed. And that's something that I'll mention about these structures is they are solidly built. You can go up to them and gently shake them and test them, and you can barely move a stick on the good ones. One thing we also found is that most of these are cleared of bark. These structural elements, the sticks or the pieces of tree are cleared of bark, which makes them last longer, something that I figured out with another researcher. Next slide. So I did, one of my first experiments was to, I was not quite believing this yet. It says, well, I'm going to set up an experiment by making my own little teepee right next to that fort thing that was slide 2. So one of these elements on the right, I believe, was pre-existing and was there. And the stick that you see in the forked groove, that's one that I found in the forest and I put there. And so I made this very simple teepee, and I would often just sort of meditate there and be quiet. And that was in late August of 2015. So simultaneously with this, I was setting up an interaction feeding experiment about 1.5 miles down the road in the state forest proper, which is sort of a side story. But I really got into that. I had some positive results with beings actually taking a peach, taking a bite out of it and putting it back, and moving sticks in a geometric pattern. And I said, that's very interesting. Not a small creature. And for a few weeks, I was sort of not going back to the site of the fort and this riverside teepee while I was active in this other location. So finally in October, I went back to the site of this. And next slide, please. Photo 4. And I was shocked to see that in the location of that three-sided teepee that I constructed was this gigantic structure. And it took me a while. I don't think I even realized this on the first day, but it's on the exact footprint of the three-sided teepee that I constructed. And you can even see the pole that's suspended in the notched tree branch on the right side. That's something that was there, but everything else was new. And simultaneously with that, I discovered that the fort, what I call the fort, or the structure that you just saw, the odd one, was completely gone. And I believe that every stick that was in that other structure got incorporated into this new structure. And the riverside teepee even was dismantled. So they recycled and made this. And one thing I'll say, I mean, you might say, well, people and all, but this is a pretty remote area of the state forest, off the beaten path. It's not on a hiking trail. It's by a river where people fish, but in my time going into the interior, I never saw a person. So, I mean, I can't prove that this was not made by people, but I found it very odd that, it appeared and nothing was disturbed around there. There were no cans, beer cans, litter. The forest floor was extremely well kept. It was like no disturbance had occurred. And I was just flabbergasted to see this. It's like, wow. So that was like the best. The early days, a lot of stuff was happening. And now it's much more infrequently. But I consider that an experiment that led me to believe that there was something going on. And I made sure that when I went into this area, nobody saw me going in or leaving. I would often go in different ways so as not to leave a path. But go on to the next photo, and I'll just get into a few more things here. Photo 5. Then in the forest interior, this is very close to where I was doing the experiments with the food and the gifting. I came across these white pines, the young white pine stand, where the pine trees were bent very low to the ground and curved, just like in a crop circle. And if you go to the next slide, photo 6, you'll see that they were still growing. This is just the other end of those trees. And I said, well, what weather phenomenon would flatten the trees like that without breaking them at all, not a crease? And the trees were still alive. And I just thought, this is really odd. And I said aloud to myself, well, what could have done this? And I was really perplexed. And I found other areas like this too, in this general part of the forest that had bent trees that I've never seen before. So I went back 2 days later. Yeah, next slide. Photo 7. And I looked down at the base of one of those bent trees and I said, holy cow. That's not quite the word I use, but that looks an awful lot like a footprint. And I bent down on my knees and I put my fingers in, and yep, there are toe holes. And I went back the next day, got a tape measure, and saw that it was close to 15 inches. And it was right at the base of these bent trees, 2 days after I had asked out loud, what did this? And this is right next to where I had set up a interaction station on an old gas grill where I had, quite a bit of activity in a while. I even put out a jar of peanut butter at one time, which they figured out how to open. I took off the part that was sealed for our protection because nobody can open those. So I took that off and I just left the peanut butter jar on top of the gas grill, hidden in this stand of trees, and something with a hand was able to get it off. Now, yes, a person could have opened it, but when I saw how the peanut butter was eaten, it did not look like something a person would do. And there are many other successful outcomes that I've had in doing those experiments, which led me to believe that, something was going on. I mean, ask yourself, if you came across, a cache of food in the woods, sort of off a side trail that's hard to get to, would you eat any of that? I wouldn't. So that was, sort of my introduction of getting into this, finding that. I just want to show a few more structures after this one. And I wanted to find corroborate, and it's just a picture for scale of how big the footprint was. Next. I wanted to see if there was any, go to 10, please. Oh yeah, this one. I went about a quarter mile down into the woods from where I found the footprint about a week later, and I found this very odd asterisk structure, which incorporates a bent tree that is hooped under something else, and also this, interlocking pattern of trees that you see cleared of bark, which to me was a structure. And in that forest, I found many other structures, over the period of about 2 years, many of them off trail and very hard. You wouldn't be able to find them unless you knew how to follow the more subtle structures to find the bigger ones. And so after all of this, I said, something's going on. I mean, I doubt people are doing this, especially off the trail and way in the thickets. Why would anybody even go in here? Next, please. This is an example from the other part of that large forest of a large asterisk shape. This shape I've seen repeated in the forest as well. This one is way off the trail, and when I was at the site too, it's one of the few times that I've heard, I believe, vocalizations, hearing like a whoop that they supposedly make, and it did scare me, and but I hung out for a while, and just sort of was hoping that one would appear, but one didn't appear in the open for me to photograph, which seems to be our experience. And I believe I have one or two more, and then that will be it for these pictures. Just last year, came across this structure, which is in a large forest northwest of Nashua. It's 36 feet long, 12 feet wide, and about 5 feet high. And I call it the Longhouse, and it's the center part of this whole collection of structures in what I found to be the most squatchy area that I've so far found in New Hampshire. And this is also a place where I set up an audio recorder last August of 2019, where I was able to seemingly capture on tape several large bipedal beings approaching the recorder and making a lot of noise. Unfortunately, not talking, but making a lot of noise, leaving and going and poking at it, and just making a racket, and clearly bipedal sounding. And I gave Scott that. Maybe we'll have a chance to play a clip later. But this is what I consider to be, the hotspot now. And next slide. One thing that tells me to take these large structures seriously, even though you would think people would most likely make these fancy teepees and everything. Well, I found this by accident on a trail. I actually took a wrong trail, and I was going up into the woods, and some mountain bikers were coming down this trail. And so this is in the COVID era in April. So I go off the trail to my right, quite a distance, to let them pass. And I look to my right, and there's this, asterisk type structure that's extremely solid, only about 3 feet high. And there's no way anyone would find this on their own. And this is just one example of dozens in that forest and many of the other forests, and more subtle structures that to me reinforce what I believe is the probability that these larger structures, such as the teepees, may indeed be built by these beings. It's not something I can prove. I know many people, even within the Bigfoot community, have conflicting opinions about these structures. But to me, it's one way that, you can sort of get a sense of their presence. The structures sometimes change over time. They get taken down and rebuilt elsewhere. And, it's something that you can sort of follow up on. And I keep a log every time I go in the woods of anything new that I notice, or even if nothing happens, which is most of the time. Say nothing happened today, but when something does happen, I want to make sure that I get it down in writing so that I can look for patterns and see if there's some sort of pattern or replication or corroboration when it comes to any of this evidence. Since I believe that the scientific method can be applied to these to this subject.
Wow, that is fascinating.
Yeah, and that's in just a few minutes, a sort of a nutshell of some of my key findings. The structures, the audio, footprints. That's not the only footprint I found, though. It was probably the best.
Wow.
So I'm convinced something odd is going on.
Interesting. So we've already gone over by a couple of minutes. If it's all right with you, Steve, can we stay on for a few more seconds or a few more minutes?
Yes.
Okay, Aleks,
Sure.
I'd like, first of all, your reaction to some of the stuff that you saw from Mark. Have you seen those sorts of structures and things like that in the past? And then, if you want to go ahead and talk about the lion situation, I thought that was an interesting conversation that we had the other day.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've seen similar sort of things, nothing perhaps as extravagant as that. I mean, I have seen bushcrafters do that sort of stuff. And I know when I did bushcrafting back in the day, we definitely did similar sort of things. So again, I always lean more on the skeptical side in terms of really things like that I believe that these creatures, if they're out there, they're very elusive. And I think their impact is a little bit kind of less than we would expect, perhaps in some respects. That's not to say there aren't areas. I mean, there are very credible reports of nests being found out in Washington State by the Olympic Project, which is a research group comprised of scientists and ex-military and police and people from various backgrounds they've brought primatologists and anthropologists actually out to these areas, and they resemble gorilla nests that are found in parts of Africa and primate nests. And even some of the nests will be up, smaller ones will be up in a tree, which is something that smaller gorillas do, the young and that sort of thing. Obviously, a huge gorilla can't really sleep in a suspended nest in a tree. So there's some interesting stuff. And yeah, I mean, I think definitely some interesting findings. And I think it's awesome that Mark is doing a great job of writing stuff down. And every time he's out there documenting what happens, I think oftentimes that's kind of forgotten with what people are researching. They just kind of go out there and do that sort of thing. So it's always good if you're heading out there, if you had an observation of anything. I mean, when I go out to my area, and as I said earlier, I'm not really a researcher. I'm not out there to really prove anything exists or doesn't. I like to talk to witnesses, and I like making documentaries about these subjects and letting those people share their experiences. I've had, a couple of strange things happen and heard noises and knocks as I've been sleeping at night in a tent and had strange stuff moving around outside, which I didn't know what it was. But what's really interesting, what I love about this field is, the more time you spend out in the woods, the more chances you have of encountering all sorts of strange things in terms of other animals. I mean, having face-to-face with moose, finding moose evidence just yesterday out in the woods, I was finding some moose scat, and from what I can tell, and from others have gathered as well, southern New Hampshire seems to be, the moose population is growing here, which is really great compared to even 40 years ago, where moose were primarily found in the northern part of the state. They're starting to move back down in here and are creating viable breeding populations. You hear weird noises. I've heard barred owls make noises I never thought they could make. Possibly heard a moose rut, which is during the mating season, which would have just ended a few weeks ago, hearing these weird noises out in the woods and a pack of coyotes freaking out in the middle of it. And then there's a couple of those times where you'll have just a weird noise where you'll head into the woods. And I've had this happen a number of times where just you'll hear something like sounds like a piece of wood knock against another knock, and then just no other sounds the rest of the night, or that goes on for a while. Strange movement, again, cannot be confirmed, but a lot of the times, I'll have a FLIR, which is a forward looking infrared camera, just to be able to confirm what's out there and seeing other animals and hopefully being able to get a glimpse of something maybe mysterious out there. But I think it's definitely an interesting pursuit. And I've found, what I'm going to say are structures out there that, again, I simply can't say regarding Mark stuff, as I haven't been in those locations. So, I mean, I'm taking his word that they're not people doing that, but I just don't know. And that's the same thing as if I was interviewing an eyewitness. I can't tell them, well, you definitely saw it or you didn't. I wasn't there. I can simply only rely on their conveying of their story and their experience. So I'm not there to deny or one way or another, I can say, you know, something's interesting without kind of denying or saying definitely this is what happened. It's just something that I find fascinating, and it gets entered into the file with other sightings and other experiences, and maybe you can start forming patterns, saying, well, hey, there's consistent behaviors being reported in New Hampshire as there are in Oklahoma and Washington State by people who are separated by thousands of miles that have nothing to do with each other, that just live on a rural homestead or rural property and have similar things happening, rocks being thrown at their house, something slapping the side of the house. The kids say they see a monster outside at night looking at them. These sorts of things that are often reported in a lot of these places, as well as stories, just like I said, going back to before there was a notion of there being something like a Bigfoot. As I mentioned earlier, the Mogollon Rim in Arizona, the Mogollon Monster was a story told by Boy Scouts that would be out in the woods in this remote area that's filled with mountain lion and elk and other creatures, seeing a strange, hairy, man-like creature. They just called it a monster. It made sense. And a lot of these stories, the wood devils, as I also mentioned earlier, in northern New Hampshire, stories, logging stories. I have actually some pictures that I did send, and we don't have to pull them up for the sake of time, but all these old newspaper clippings that talk about people seeing wild men in the 1800s, or once the gorilla became known, they would say, you know, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania resident was attacked by a gorilla. People seeing wild men, hairy ape-like creatures, lost tribe of ape men in the Rocky Mountains is one of the newspapers. This one actually in particular from 1924, ape men 8 feet tall, and all sorts of things like that I think create a little bit of a basis. Combine that with some of the Native American folklore, and some of those masks and costumes that really look very ape-like. I think it creates an interesting possibility that there may be something out there that we're not familiar with, and how widespread these beings are, that's unknown. There are obviously a lot of reports, and primarily, as I mentioned, in wooded rural areas. And usually, I mean, you'd think the White Mountains are the place with the most amount of sightings. That actually isn't true in the case of New Hampshire, because there's the least amount of people living in those areas. I mean, you have wide swaths of just woods. Where do people see moose up north? Well, on the roads. Where do people see bears? In the back of the hotels or on the deck of the Mount Washington Hotel, because the animals come out there. So usually the sightings happen on small towns, right where nature butts up against civilization. That's where people encounter all sorts of other animals, and that's where a lot of Bigfoot sightings, majority of sightings are actually road crossings. People see something run across the road, and they said, well, that was no bear. So like many other animals, road crossings seem to be very common. But yeah, so it's very interesting. And I think for people who are doing that sort of research, you know, set some standards for yourself, definitely write stuff down, document it well. So if you ever were to, you know, make the case or to need to show what happened on August 25th, 2015, you could go back then and say, well, I have this written down. This is what happened then. I think that's just really important, just in general. It's citizen science. And like I said, you'll probably have many other interesting things happen, the least of which may be Bigfoot related. You'll probably encounter all sorts of other animals. That's one of my favorite parts of being out in the woods, is just seeing what I can find, seeing if I can find other animals, encounter all sorts of stuff out there. And I think that's great. And then to just end on the mountain lion topic, now that's a very interesting topic, of course, and that could be a whole show just about that. But you have people across New England and the East Coast that claim to have experienced or seen mountain lions. And the states all have a sort of similar hostile, perhaps, a response to it, and they deny a lot of the evidence and the reports. And 2 years I spent doing a documentary on mountain lions in New England across the region. I interviewed New Hampshire Fish and Game, Vermont game wardens, people in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, basically the whole region. People who were amateur researchers, kind of like with the Bigfoot subject, they just claimed, well, I had a mountain lion sighting, and then I wanted to prove it to people because nobody believed me. 2011, there was a mountain lion that was killed in Connecticut, near Milford, Connecticut, about an hour north of New York City. Nobody, could imagine that's where a mountain lion would be killed. And the DNA evidence that they found, DNA analysis they did on its origins, were that it was from South Dakota, actually, originally. In the Dakotas, there's known populations of mountain lions. Genetic makeup was from that area. I actually interviewed a police officer who claimed to have seen that very mountain lion a couple days before it was killed. 5 miles down the road from where it was killed, he told his colleagues, and nobody believed him. They said, oh, it was probably just a bobcat. He said, no, I swear it was a mountain lion. Lo and behold, one turns up dead, hit on the highway not too far from there, validated as sighting. Now, there are thousands of sightings like that across New England, and folks are just, everybody probably knows somebody who claims to have seen something out there or had an experience. And there's a couple instances where there's been viable DNA evidence that's been found, especially in Massachusetts, my documentary, I interview a lady whose horse was attacked by something, and she found blood and hair sample evidence that tested both at the University of Florida and Arizona in prominent, well-known, well-respected labs, came back as male mountain lion. And the state of Massachusetts has not followed up on that and has really sort of dropped the ball on that. But it's like I said, it could be a whole another show unto itself.
Right. Well, I want to thank you. We easily could have gone on for another hour. I think I have enough questions for both of you that they had a discussion that would have lasted that amount of time. But I want to thank the audience, first of all, for participating and for tuning in. And very importantly, a huge thanks to both of you for being so generous with your time and your expertise. We all really appreciate it. So thank you very much. Next month, we have a topic, I think it's November 18th. It's food in a changing climate. So I hope you all will tune in for that. And with that, with all the thanks that we can generate, we'll pass it off to Scott and take us to the end, Scott.
Thank you, Rick.